Okay, so we're going to learn how to make a projectile skill. We're going to learn how the animation works and how to deal damage with it. As you can see here, I have a bow and arrow that gets equipped when I hold down the skill, and it shoots out a fireball, and on impact it creates a little bit of a sound effect and explosion. It deals 1 damage, and yeah, it works pretty well. Alright, so let's go into the combat preset environment here. First off, we're going to need a projectile. Then we're going to also need a skill that we can assign the projectile to instantiate in. And then we're going to have to add it into the class. So let's go over this all right now. I'm going to get rid of what I currently have. So when you create a new skill, you just click on new skill, you give it a name, and you put it in the certain folder that you want to put it in. So in my case, I created a skill called Snipe. Now, because this is something that I want to aim with, specifically like with a bow or whatever, you can choose the aiming skill type. There's a few of these different types of skills that you can choose, either a hold skill, a normal skill, an instant skill. An instant skill basically doesn't have any animations, it just happens immediately. A hold skill is something that maybe you can charge up or that you can hold and it does like a continuous animation or a continuous damage. A normal skill is simple. You press it and it plays an animation and it's just a normal skill. I haven't really worked with combo skills, so I'm not too sure how they work. But since we're trying to aim with a bow and we're making a projectile, aiming skill works here as well. You could, of course, create projectiles with something like a hold skill or a normal skill, but in our case, I specifically want to aim, so we're going to choose aim skill, and it's going to have its own type of preset and options because we chose aiming skill. So from the top, we have basic settings, enable fall protection. I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure this means that when you fall while using the skill, then you won't take fall damage. And right underneath, there's a relevant option here, which allows you to cast mid-air. So if you're in the air, if you toggle this off, then you won't be able to use the skill. If you toggle it on, then you can use it. So up to you how you want to configure that. As far as the aiming settings, you can choose whether you want to toggle or hold the skill in order to aim with it. You can choose if you want to allow aiming while moving. The numerical configuration part. For numerical configuration, if you want a cooldown, you can turn this on and give it a cooldown. For usage limit, you can set the amount of times that you can use the skill. For resource consumption, if you have something like stamina that you want the ability to use when you use it, you can turn that on here. Now, as far as targeting range, I don't think this actually makes a difference since we're aiming and we're going to be shooting the skill in a certain direction. So I don't think having a cylinder or a sector, I don't think this actually matters to us since this isn't like a physical attack where you swing your sword in front of you or something. So I'm going to skip this part for now, and same thing with the radius and height. It shouldn't really matter. If you want to destroy the skill when you reach the usage limit, if you have this on, you can turn that on as well. But for now, we're just going to leave the settings like this. Now let's go ahead into our animation editor. In our animation editor, since this is a holding skill, you need to select the kind of animation you want to use for the aiming animation. Now here we have two options. We have a bow aiming or we have a throwing animation. You can aim to throw something or you can aim to shoot something with a bow. So let's go ahead and click on bow aiming animation. Depends on what you need, of course. And you can see that it already fills in these things for us and we don't have to worry about this for now. This is outside of the scope of the tutorial, but basically you have one part of the aiming animation, the second part, and then the third part, which is, I believe, the release. If we preview this, you'll see it kind of looks a bit weird when you play it in this kind of timeline here. For some reason, I still don't know if this is a bug or if this is just me not understanding something, but the first part of the animation only takes 0.1 seconds. So it just kind of happens and then immediately goes into the second animation, which lasts for 1.66 seconds. The thing is, it kind of looks weird in the timeline, but whenever you play it in game, it doesn't look weird, as you saw at the beginning of the video. So I'm not really sure what's causing the issue here, but if anybody knows, please let me know. But you can safely ignore this. This doesn't actually look like this in game when you're aiming. But anyway, this is the second part. The character is in a holding animation where they're pulling back the bow, and then they release the arrow. Now you might ask yourself, well, okay, there's no bow here. This is just the animation without anything. The character's not really holding anything. So let's go ahead and add the bow. Now, with all animations and all kinds of skills and attacks, the bow and the sword or the claymore, whatever it is that your character is holding or using in the attack, is all a visual effect. It doesn't actually exist. It's not like a real object. It's more of a visual effect. And inside of the status track, you can add a add event, and you can click on VFX playing. When you click on this, you'll see this VFX playing little bar here, and you can see that it covers a certain amount of time on the timeline. You can stretch it to whatever you want. Preferably in this case, if we want to have our bow be the VFX, then we want it to span throughout the entire animation. So I'm just going to drag by the ends here and stretch it to fill the whole timeline. Now if you see over here on the top right in the VFX playing inspector here, you can choose what VFX you want to play. And there's actually a lot of things that you can choose from. If we were to search up bow and then scroll towards the bottom, we actually have a couple of bow options here, and they look differently depending on which one you choose. So let's go ahead and go with bow number 5, since that's the one that I was showing off at the start. And you have a couple of options here, so let's just go through them. For the play VFX asset sound effects, so this is the actual sound effects that the bow makes. So when you're drawing the bow or when you shoot the bow has its own effects that it plays. You have the unit attachment point. Now currently it's set to the root node, which is right here where it is. You can see that it's obviously not placed correctly in the character's hand. So what is the unit attachment point? So let's go back real quick. Let's go to our player. And if you go to the edit character section here on the player, you'll see that there are custom attachment points here. If you click on advanced editing, you'll see all the unit attachment points that the player has. And these are basically points on the character that you can attach things on. And these attachment points follow the movement of the character. So for example, if we go to left hand weapon, you'll see that this is the attachment point, and it follows the location and the orientation of the left hand. Now notice how the left hand and the left hand weapon are actually a bit different. They are around the same location. I mean, this is the left hand right here, and this is the left hand weapon attachment point, but even though they're at the same point, they act differently. The way they follow the player's movements, rotation on the hand is a little bit different. So make sure that we're selecting the left hand weapon so that we can actually place our bow in the left hand, which is where the correct position is here. Let's go ahead and copy this name for the attachment point, and back in our animation editor, let's go ahead, click on the VFX playing, and put in the unit attachment point right in here. Let's just paste it in. And if you just play the animation, you'll see that it actually looks proper as well when they're aiming it, and then when they let go, it follows the movement of the left hand as it should. Now, if something isn't to your liking here, if you don't like the way that they're holding the bow, you can actually change the rotation or location of the bow. Like if I were to change the x-axis to maybe something like 50, or maybe that's too dramatized, maybe like 20, you'll see that they hold the bow a bit differently. It's kind of slanted and looks a bit more like gangster style, you know? So you could kind of mess around with how the bow looks when the character's holding it. But yeah, that's definitely up to you. We also have zoom, and zoom controls the size of the bow or the VFX asset that you use. So if I do something like 2, you'll see that the bow becomes double the size, which definitely looks cool. You could totally play around with this for something like really strong weapons, for them to be just you know, maybe bigger in size or something, to give a really cool feeling to them. Or you can make them really small like this and give them a weaker appearance if you so choose. And lastly, we have the follow location and rotation options here. Like I said, you have the attachment point that the bow will stick to. If you turn this off, however, and you play the animation, you see that the bow just kind of stands where it initially is, which is where the left hand initially is, and then it just doesn't follow the player. So it's really up to you how you want to customize this, but this is all that you need for the actual bow. So one thing you'll notice that if you just test play here is that the character won't actually go into an entering stance. The camera won't change its perspective when you click on the ability, and also you won't have a crosshair. And how we fix this, how we add this, is by let's add a new status track. And if we click on add event, there's going to be enter aiming state and show crosshair options. Let's go ahead and enter the aiming state, and we're going to enter the aiming state when the character starts the animation. We're going to just drag it out until they release the bow, which is about here. And when the character releases the bow, then we want to exit the aiming state. So we also want to add the, let's add another track here. And we also want to add the crosshair. So it'll have like a wind up period, and then when the character is actually aiming, then we can show the crosshair. And similarly, we can end this when the character stops aiming with the bow, when they release the projectile. So if we just play this back, you'll see that it looks like this. Now in the enter aiming state, it also has a couple of options. You can preview what it looks like to aim with the bow if you just click on this enable secondary screen preview. And you can see the camera FOV. You can make the FOV really zoomed out or is really zoomed in. I'm just gonna keep it at the default settings here at 45. And you can change where the offset of the camera is. Right now it seems like the camera's in front of the player, I assume, since I don't see the player here. So let's go ahead and zoom or move the camera back a bit. And there you go, you can see that we see the character from behind. So this is where the camera would be when you enter the aiming state. This is how the player will actually figure out that they have entered the aiming state. And this actually happens as a transition. You can see here the transition duration. You can set it to be instant if you set it to 0. Similarly, when you exit the transition, you can make it 0. But a nice value would just be 1. It takes 1 full second to transition into this new camera angle. If you want to allow the players to see more of their surroundings, you can zoom out a bit more. Maybe you can offset the x-axis to a bit more to the right. That's a bit too much there. Let me do like something like 0.5. You can also change how much they are allowed to look up or down. So you can go ahead and adjust these values. They're maxed out at -45 and 45. If I were to put like -90 here, you'll see that it doesn't work. If you want to only allow centered, for example, centered aiming, you can put both of these to 0. I think here that the camera FOV is a bit too much, so I'm just going to go and zoom in just like that. I think that looks pretty nice. I'm going to close this, and let's open up the show crosshair. You don't actually have to configure anything. This is simply just an option to toggle the crosshair's visibility, and that's it. Okay, so that's most of the setup for the animation itself. And now what we want to do is actually fire off a bullet. We want to fire a projectile at some point in the animation, right here actually, where the character lets go of the bow and the shot should fire. First, we need to create a projectile. So let's go ahead and do that. Inside of the projectile tab, you can create a new projectile. I already made one called bullet. So let's go ahead and take a look at the settings that I used. We're going to go a little bit in depth here and explain what most of these mean. As far as the basic settings, you can choose what you want the projectile to be. There are a couple of options for like, I guess it can be a wooden box or a dirty fruit or a toy block, which definitely doesn't look like a toy block. But yeah, that's an option if you want it. However, most of you will probably not want to choose a model. Instead, you're probably going to want to choose a visual effect. So we're going to stick with empty object. I'm going to show you how to make it actually appear like something in a second. Of course, with the zoom options, that just controls how big it is on a certain axis. We're not going to worry about this. Let's just close it. For native collision, if you want to control through a node graph or through a script when you want to allow the projectile to collide with something, you can turn this off and control it in the script. But for most people, they're going to want the projectile's collision to always be active as soon as it exists in the world. So we're going to keep this initially effective to on. If you want it to be climbable, which it really depends on what you're making here. If you're making a bullet, obviously you're not going to be able to climb it because it's just moving too fast. But if for whatever reason your projectile is something that you want the character to climb on or jump on or whatever, you can turn climbable on. But for the most part, you're not going to want to do this. For the battle parameters, you can set them to inherited from creator, or in my case, if you just want to keep it independent and give it its own values. So in this case, I mean, it doesn't matter what HP it has, we can just set this to 0. For attack, oh, it looks like we can't do it to 0, it just makes it 1. For attack, you can do whatever attack you want the projectile to do. So in my case, I just keep it at 1. Defense also doesn't really matter since our projectile isn't something that people can really damage. That's not our intention, so it doesn't matter here. For the life cycle settings, you can set a duration for how long the projectile lives in the world. So in my case, I can set it to something like 5 seconds. If you wanted to just live and die in 1 second because you don't want to keep it around for too long, that's up to you. I'll just keep it at 5 for now. You can also control when the object will get destroyed after traveling a certain amount of distance in the X or Y directions. And if you want some kind of custom ability unit to run when it dies, then you can do so here, but we're going to go over what ability units are in a second. Now, if you click on this section, you'll see now we have an option to actually give our projectile a look. If you go into the advanced editing section here, you can choose what kind of visual effects you want for it. In my case, what I did is I wrote down fire, and I chose this pyro whopper flower animation visual effect, and it looks pretty nice for a bullet, so I just kept that. You can also choose if you want to play the sound effects that go with the visual effect. For follow location, you usually want to keep this on. What this does is it's asking you if you want the visual effect to follow the movement of the projectile. Now, 99% of the time you want this as turned on. Similarly, for the follow rotation, if the rotation of your projectile changes over time, then you might want to keep this checked as well. But for me, it doesn't really matter since it's just going to go in a straight line. There really shouldn't be any rotation, so I'll just keep that off. As far as the attachment point, to be honest, I'm not really sure what the point of asking this is, since it doesn't seem like it can be editable. I'm sure that I'm not understanding something here, but at the moment it just seems you can only choose this root node, and also these values are not editable. It could be that it's just the visual effects that I chose doesn't support the option, but I have to experiment with this a little bit more before I can really say what this does. For the zoom factor, this also determines the size of our object. If we set this to 2, you'll see we'll have a bigger fireball. Set it to 1, it's the normal size. And of course the offset and the rotation of the visual effects in relation to the projectile itself. Alright, so let's go ahead and X out of here. Next, we're going to go into the projectile motion device. This controls the direction and the type of motion that the projectile will have. You can see here that it currently has a linear projectile type, which means that it just goes in a straight line. If we do a parabolic projectile, you'll see that it kind of falls off. There is a tracking projectile option, which will literally track an object on the scene. It'll fly towards it. So for example, I have a hilichurl in my world, which I can select, and it will just fly to that hilichurl no matter where I shoot it from. And as far as radial fire, I'm actually not sure what this is. The name suggests that maybe it's shooting the projectile in all sorts of directions, but then it's also asking to choose an around object, which I'm not too sure what this is, and I haven't really tested it myself. But anyway, we're going to go with linear projectile because we just wanted to travel in a straight line. And if we go ahead and set the speed to something like 50, which is quite fast, and we preview the motion, you'll see that it flies pretty rapidly. So let's go ahead and set our initial speed on the z-axis to 30. Now, since the z-axis is forward and backwards, if we give the z value an initial speed, then it's going to go forward at that speed, whereas the x value is to the left or to the right. So if you give it a value there, it's going to, like if I were to just do 0 here and 30 here, then when I shoot the projectile, it's actually not going to shoot forward, it's going to shoot off to the right, which is not what the normal behavior is for something like a bow and arrow or a gun shooting a bullet. So let's go ahead and set the z-axis to 30 speed. As far as acceleration, you can set how much you want it to accelerate. So if I do something like 50, which is quite high, and I set the acceleration duration, how long I want it to accelerate for, even just 1 second, let's go ahead and preview it. It actually gets much faster over time. It might be easier to see if we start the speed off with 1. Let's go ahead and preview. Yep, you see that it starts off slow and it goes really fast. In my case, I don't want there to be any acceleration. You can actually decelerate the object if you want the object to slow down over time. So if I do something like -50 with an initial speed of 30, you'll see that it goes and it stops. And it actually even goes backwards, and it keeps the speed that it's going. Even though it has stopped accelerating, the speed changed to a negative value, and now that's the new direction that it's going. Alright, so let's reset everything back to 0. Let's give it a speed of 30 like I intended it to. Now there's one thing that you have to keep in mind, and that's when you set too high of a speed, sometimes the bullet is going to just go past, or it's going to go through an entity or an object if it's too thin and it doesn't have enough time in the world to detect that it hit it. So if I set the speed here to 100, for example, you'll see that it actually goes quite fast. And if I have a thin tree or a small entity like a hilichurl, it might actually go through the hilichurl before it even has a chance to realize that it hit it. And so there's a couple of ways around this, but generally speaking, you don't want to make it a really high value so that you're able to actually compute things efficiently. But even if you do want to give it a high value, there's still a way to properly detect collisions that we're going to go over very soon. As far as ground hugging movement, I have no idea what this does. When you preview it, it kind of seems like it's more or less the same with or without. I don't know what this does, how this works. It could be that if it detects that it collides with the ground, actually, we might as well just test this out here. Let's go ahead with -5 and see what happens with this enabled. Alright, so moving on to the on-hit detection. Let's go ahead and click on advanced editing. Now this part is really important for your projectile to work the way you want it to. So this is the on-hit detection rules section. Okay, this is going to determine what rules the projectile should follow when it detects that it has hit something. So you can see that I actually already gave it an area, an on-hit area. You can choose between a square, a capsule, or a circle. I gave it a sphere, a circle with a radius of 0.25, which matches the size of the VFX of the fireball, just to keep it consistent with the visual. But if you want to be a bit more forgiving, you can give it a higher radius to kind of make it easier for players to hit different entities with it. But I'm just going to go back to 0.25 here. Now what the on-hit area does is when this collision area hits some kind of entity with some kind of hurt box or some kind of collision, whatever it's able to interact with, once it comes into contact within the radius, it's going to trigger the on-hit rules. It's going to detect an on-hit and it's going to run the rules. So let's go ahead and figure out what the rules are. There are a bunch of different rules that we can choose from. So let's go ahead and start from the trigger type. We have a single trigger, which means that the projectile can only get triggered once for the on-hit detection, meaning that the first thing it comes into contact with is the only thing it will come into contact with from a collision perspective. It can still pass through things, it can still pass through them, but it's not going to count it as a hit. It's only going to get triggered once. Then we have non-repeating trigger, which means that it will be able to hit multiple things, but it can only hit one thing once. So for example, if I have two hilichurls and the bullet passes through both hilichurls, it will hit the first hilichurl and the second hilichurl, but it's not going to hit the first hilichurl more than once. It's only going to hit each hilichurl a total of one time and no more than that. As far as repeating trigger, this will allow you to hit the same entity more than one time. So if I have a really slow projectile and within like a second the on-hit detection detects that it hit it like 10 times, then it will be able to hit that unit 10 times while the on-hit area is inside of its collision or inside of its hurt box or whatever. Now in my case, I just wanted to hit the first thing that it hits and then no longer trigger any more afterwards, so I'm just going to hit single trigger. For detection delay time, this actually is kind of important. It depends on what your bullet is allowed to hit. But basically what this does is it waits a certain amount of time before it allows the on-hit area to detect that it has hit something. So it's basically like a grace period for when you instantiate the projectile. Now in my case, I wanted to be able to hit things as soon as it spawns in. But one example where you might want to add a delay is if you're allowing the bullet to hit yourself, but you don't want it to hit yourself when you first shoot it, when you first instantiate it in the world, because you don't want it to hit yourself immediately after it's created, or you don't want it to hit something immediately after it's created. You want to give it a little bit of a grace time for it to exist in the world and travel a certain distance, and then after a certain amount of time it can start hitting and triggering things. For my use case, I'm going to keep this at 0 and enable continuous collision. So this is what I was talking about with the speed. If your projectile is moving very fast and it's having a hard time detecting that it is hitting things, you can enable continuous collision detection, and it's going to use up more resources. It's going to be a little bit less efficient on the computing side, but it's going to be much more accurate in detecting when it's colliding with something because it's continuously checking if it's colliding something. Whereas if you would turn this off, it would only do it every 10 frames, for example, rather than doing it every frame. Now, if your projectile isn't moving that fast, it's highly advisable for you to keep this off. However, if you are having a really fast projectile for whatever reason, it's advisable that you turn this on so that your bullet doesn't just travel through objects without actually hitting them. And there are a couple of options here for when you want this continuous collision detection to happen, to occur. You can have it always run and just be continuously effective, or you can do it when it's only above a certain threshold of speed. So if your projectile has the ability to move at, for example, only 10 units a second versus 100 units a second, if it has the ability to do both, then what you can do is you can give it a speed threshold of like 50, and you can say, okay, when the projectile is moving faster than 50 meters per second, then I want the continuous collision detection to activate. Otherwise, if it's below the speed, there's no reason to activate it. So this is the speed limit right here. For me, I just want to keep this at continuously effective because my projectile will move at a constant speed of 30 all the time. And of course, we have the detection radius here, which you should keep to the same radius as your on-hit area. It is interesting to point out that the documentations say that this value can be 0, and when it is 0, then it starts to act like a raycast and not really like a collision hitbox. The only issue is that if you try to set it to 0 radius, it actually defaults to 0.1. So I'm not sure if there's a discrepancy in the documentation or if this is a bug in the editor. But yeah, it seems like there's a minimum value and you can't set it to 0 at the moment. For the filter settings, if you choose Boolean filter, it's basically just going to do a true or false statement comparison. Whenever it collides with something, it's going to see if what it collides with is something that it is allowed to collide with. As far as integer filter, I'm not too sure when you would use an integer filter, but I do believe this has something to do with filtering something in the node graph. So I'm not too sure how this works. I don't think it's something that you'll have to use very often, but if somebody does know how this works, please let me know in the comments. And of course, there's an option to enable the filters below, which are these 3 filters right here. If we turn them off, it's not going to filter through anything. It's just going to hit everything. However, if we want to filter out this projectile to only hit certain things, then we can choose them here. We can choose what faction the entity will belong to. In this case, I want it to be the hostile faction. You can do all factions, only your own or allies. For the entity type filter, you can choose all of them, or you can only choose objects, characters, or creations. In my case, I wanted to only attack creations, so like the Miliastra, for example, so I'll just choose creations. As far as the hit layer filter, we can also choose if we want to hit the hurt box, if we wanted to hit itself, or if we wanted to hit some part of the scene. In my case, I just want to hit the hurt box of the entity, which I believe all creatures have, like the Miliastra, so we're only going to want to collide with the hurt box of a creation that is inside of a hostile faction. And finally, we have our on-hit trigger settings. So this is what's going to happen when the on-hit detection activates. It's going to first filter through the thing that it hit to see if it should collide with it, if it should have the on-hit detection go off. And if it does go off, it's then going to ask you what you want to do. And it's going to ask you to add ability units. If we X out of here and go into this section here, you'll see that there's a section for ability units. If we go into advanced editing, you can add different types of ability units. In this case, I already created 2. So let's go ahead and look at those. I'm going to delete this one. And let's look at our deal damage. I named it deal damage. So what this does is it tells your projectile how to act when it realizes that it has collided with something. So it's giving us a couple of options here. You can either create a hitbox attack, which will directly attack a hitbox. You can choose direct attack, which will just attack whatever it came into contact with. Now, in my case, since I chose that it can only filter through the hurt boxes and not something like the scene and the object, then a direct attack is just going to attack a hurt box. It's not going to attack anything else because nothing else is chosen. However, if you do choose scene and object self-collision, then it will have the ability to directly attack those things and not only a hurt box like an entity or a creation will have. If I wanted to only hit a hitbox, I would choose hitbox attack, and then I can choose where we want to scan for a hitbox, the radius, the detection area for scanning for a hitbox. If a hitbox falls inside of this detection radius, it's going to attack that hitbox. So it's usually better to make this hitbox a little bit bigger than your on-hit area hitbox, just so that it can guarantee that it will pick up on the hitbox it collided with. But in our case, I'm just going to keep this at direct attack. For base location, this is actually kind of tricky, but it's good for you to understand. There's self and then there's on-hit location. Whenever your projectile realizes that it has hit something, it's going to store two positions. It's going to store the position of itself, and it's going to store the position of the thing that it hit. So if you want the hitbox to spawn at the on-hit location rather than the location of the projectile, then you should choose the on-hit location. And on-hit location usually gives you a more reliable method of making sure that your hitbox will collide with the on-hit location. You can also choose to add a visual effects whenever it hits something. You can add or remove a unit status to the thing that you hit. You can create another projectile. You can destroy the projectile if it hits something, or you can recover HP to the thing that you hit. Now in my case, I just wanted to deal damage, so I'm going to choose direct attack. It's going to directly attack the thing that it has collided with, which is only going to be a hitbox. I'm going to set the damage coefficient to 1. The damage coefficient will simply multiply the projectile's attack with this value. So if, for example, the damage coefficient is 5 and your projectile's attack is 2, the damage is going to come out as 10. You can also increment damage afterwards if you want to just come up with some wacky calculations. If I added, for example, 5 to this, and this was 5, then this turns out to be 10, and then I add an additional 5 for 15. However, there's just something for you to know, that if you choose for it to be true damage, it's not going to calculate the attack times the coefficient. It's only going to use the value of the damage increment. So if I choose this and I put 5 in here, the damage will always be 5 no matter what. As far as the elemental type, I'll just choose Elementalist because it should just be a physical attack. It's a bullet, even though it does have a pyro visual effect, but that's fine. That's just for visual effects. Elemental attack potency, hit type, attack type, interrupt value, all these things you can just leave. If you want to get creative and add different types of effects and elemental effects, then you can go ahead and change these to your liking. If you have custom aggro configurations in the settings, then this is most likely where you'll be able to set the aggro so that enemies will be able to target you or someone else depending on what the aggro configuration is in here. I'll make an aggro tutorial later in the future once I fully understand how this works. In the meantime, this isn't really important. As far as the on-hit performance, you can play an effect when the projectile hits the on-hit target. Of course, it also has the option to play its sound effects. You can change the size of the visual effect. In my case, I chose a little explosion right here. For a mute damage pop-up, you can get rid of the damage indicator that happens when you attack the entity if you want to, if you don't want to see the amount of damage that you have done to the entity. And that's pretty much it for the settings here. I also created a destroy self ability unit, and in this section here you can delay the time it takes for the entity to be destroyed. You can set a delay time for when it destroys itself so that it has time to run all of its other things like dealing damage and playing a visual effect. So in my case I just set it to 0.1 seconds to give it just a little bit of time. Make sure after all your changes you click save so that everything gets saved and applied to the projectile. And now that we made our projectile, we can finally go ahead into our skill, go inside the animation editor, and finally create a node graph event. In my case, you can see already here that I have one called shoot bullet. So let's go ahead and add an event, open up Miliastra Sandbox, and I'm going to show you my shoot bullet node graph, and we'll go over that right now. You have to go inside the Client Node Graph Resource Explorer because all animation and skill related nodes and node graphs live on the client and not the server. So go ahead and create yourself a node graph. I made mine called Shoot Bullet. Let's go ahead and take a look at what this is. We have our node graph begins node, which signals the start of the node graph. This is going to get called in our animation timeline when the animation reaches our node graph event. It's going to call this node. Now I connected it here to a camera orientation detection data node, and this node finds the angle that the player is aiming at and gives you that angle for you to use when you create the projectile. But if you just wanted to create the projectile without any fancy logic, you can just use this node and connect it directly. This takes in a location for where to spawn the projectile. It takes the projectile's prefab ID, which we can find right here in the projectile settings here, prefab ID, just copy that. You just paste it in here. You can use the attachment point rotation on the character, or in my case for the rotation, you can use the camera orientation. And the camera orientation, like I said, is where the camera is aiming. As you're moving up and down, looking left and right, or up and down towards the ground or towards the sky, it will calculate that rotation and spit it out for you here. You can plug this in into the create rotation variable on the node. But if you don't care about the rotation or where the player is aiming and you just want it to fire and have the motion be dictated by the projectile itself, which we set up here in the projectile motion device settings, then you can ignore this part and you don't have to use it. But if you do want to shoot the projectile at the angle that the character is looking with the camera, then you want to use this node here. The launch location is going to be the attachment point that we were talking about earlier. I actually created a custom attachment point called fire point. If we go into the character and check it out, you'll see that the fire point is just a point that's right in front of the player, so that the projectile doesn't spawn inside of the player, but rather right in front of them. I put this into the launch location. For the nearest distance and furthest distance, I believe these are the distances at which the player can be from the camera in order for the detection data to work. So if the player is 0 meters away from the camera or 500 meters away from the camera or anywhere in between, this camera orientation detection data will work. Otherwise, if the player is somehow more than 500 meters away from the camera, this isn't going to pick it up. It's not going to calculate anything. If your projectile tracks a certain target, you can put the track target here. But in my case, this just goes in a straight line, so it doesn't matter for me. The projectile faction is going to be the same faction that the player is. So I'm going to get the current character and get the entity faction of it and toss it in here. And that's basically it. The node graph begins. We get the angle that the character is aiming. We put it into this fixed point projectile launch, which creates a projectile, uses the location and rotation of the player to point the projectile in a certain direction. And we just want to make sure that the projectile faction matches the player's faction. Back in our animation editor, all we have to do is right click, add event, and choose our node graph event. And in my case, I'm going to place it right here when the character releases. Let me just get a better angle here. In my case, I'm going to place it where the character releases the bow, which is when obviously the bullet needs to be shot. If you want to shoot multiple bullets or one bullet after the other, you can place them right after the other like this. Or if you want to shoot multiple at the same time, you can go ahead and add a new node graph event track and make this more visually understandable. You can just add another event here like this, layer them right on top of each other, and now you're going to shoot 2 bullets like this. You don't really need another track. You can delete this and then just add the event right on top of each other, and you'll have 2 on top of each other, even 3. But just for visual sake, so that you don't accidentally confuse yourself, just make sure to separate the tracks and make it more visually understandable this way. So okay, now that we have our animation done, let's go ahead and hit save. And of course, we need to now add this skill to the player's class. Let's go ahead and click on our custom class, our player class. And inside of this section here, there's going to be a normal attack, or perhaps a custom button skill or active skill, wherever you want to put this. Just go ahead. In my case, I'm going to use the normal attack, and I'm going to choose the snipe skill, which is what I called it. Now we can go ahead and click on test play. Now, because the tree, for example, is not a creation, doesn't have a hitbox, and it's not being filtered out by my projectile, it's actually just going to go right through it, as if it doesn't even exist. But if I shoot the hilly chill, you'll see that it does damage, and it actually gets destroyed 0.1 second after colliding with him, which is really, really cool. Actually, I think this is a bit more than 0.1 second. I think the server just kind of takes some time for it to get destroyed, like the engine itself is kind of slow. But yeah, it basically just disappears more or less right away. And we can shoot and we can aim, and you can see that while we're aiming that the actual camera zooms in. Now, one issue you might notice is that when we zoom in and hold the aim for a long time, we actually stop aiming and the camera comes back to our character. It doesn't actually zoom in for as long as we'd like. And that's actually because if you look at our animation timeline here, you'll see that the enter aiming state is confined to our second animation, because our second animation comes from here and ends here, and our enter aiming state actually ends right before the second animation ends, and doesn't bleed into the third part of the animation, which is actually when the character lets go of the bow. So what's happening here is once this 1.66 seconds of the second bow animation ends, it's going to stop aiming as well. If we wanted to continue aiming until we let go of the bow, then we want to let it bleed into the third part of the animation, and same thing for our crosshair. We want the crosshair to show until we just let go. So let's go ahead and test this out. And now we can see that if I hold it, you'll see that we no longer zoom back out, and the crosshair stays, and we're able to keep zooming in. Let's actually try to shoot the helitril from here. Oh yeah. And notice that because we toggled the option to allow to use this ability when we're in the air, I can actually jump off and use it in the middle of my jump and shoot maybe a trick shot, except I kind of suck. But yeah, you get the idea. And again, the reason this doesn't go away is because in our animation editor, we assign the zoom in and the crosshair to be active until we let go. And so we haven't let go of the skill yet, so this persists until we let go. And that pretty much covers the tutorial. This was a pretty lengthy tutorial. It was kind of long and in-depth. There are some things that I couldn't cover just because I myself don't know about them yet. But for the majority of use cases, I think this tutorial should cover everything enough. And until we get some better documentation, we're just going to have to make do and experiment and try to figure it out as we test and mess around with the editor a little bit. So I hope this video helped. If you have any questions, because I'm sure a lot of things here might have been a little difficult to understand first try, just ask your questions in the comments and I will be sure to answer them as best as I can.